Thank you for that. You know, I don't want to miss the fact that we are really on hallowed ground here. Scott's has made it possible for the Warbird presentation to celebrate the career and all the patriotic interest that we got in our Warbird survivors that did so much to protect our freedoms. You know, the Warbird Alley will be here for time to come, and of course behind you there's a memorial to the Circle of Honor, honoring all the branches of service as well as the Army Air Corps. And so my thanks to Scott. Let's give him one more round of applause for me. And I know Mark Baker was the guy who had to make the decision. Jim takes all the power, but Mark is the man, and I'm never quite sure I stand with him since my racers occasionally run into other racers, and I find myself upside down on that sometimes. I do want to give you one Jim Hagedorn story before I sit down. You know, I set the hook on him one day, and he did come by to have a discussion with his marketing people, with my marketing people, to discuss a racing program. And so he got off his Falcon, and the Mustang, the Old Crow was in the hangar there, and he expressed curiosity about it. I asked him if he wanted to go for a ride, and little did I know that he'd been a check pilot that checked out the air combat capabilities of squadrons throughout the United States. You know, he would show up on their field and he'd check out, he'd go out dogfight with them and find out if they were up to snuff. But as I thought about him wanting to get in my airplane, I really didn't know what his background other than he'd been an Air Force pilot. And I said, you know, I could go out and do some vendor golf here. I could go out and putz it around, or I could come back and satisfy my own interest today. And I said, Jim Hagedorn, you're on your own. We went off for a flight. It was pretty spectacular. As much as it seemed like we were going faster, we never went faster than 250 below 10,000 feet. But we did lay the trees over. It was a fact. And he got back. I thought his people and my people would be off taking care of business, which should have been occurring. But they were waiting on the boss to come back. And so he spread his wing. He spread his feet on my wing, stood like this, put his arms on his hips. And you know what I'm going to do? He said, boys, you know, I've been around the world twice behind a tanker and an F-16. He says, I broke the sound barrier over a house over here, repute in Babcock one time. He said, I ain't never been that fast, that close to the ground. And he wouldn't get off on me till he had an airplane. He was flying at that time. His wife Carly is here. He was flying at that time a Mooney to and from Long Island, New York, from Dayton area. And he'd had some bad luck with his Mooney, with the engine quitting. And so when he told me he wanted a Mustang, I said, well, what are you going to do with it? I said, you're not going to fly it over New York, are you? He said, well, maybe once or twice a week. I said, well, there's only 2 airplanes in the country that I would have confidence that might be okay for that mission, and you know, I'm pretty proud of them, and I didn't really need a third one because I knew I had a third one coming. And so then we made a deal on Bud Anderson's Old Crow. But he was as respectful of Bud and what Bud did and what the airplane meant to Bud and what it meant to all the patriots we've got in our country. And so he's as supportive I am as Bud and the Warbird movement. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the airplane. I actually read a book about midnight last night, so I get the facts straight, so I wrote some of it down here. In the 10 years, by 1940, the U.S. aviation industry and the technologies that were being put into the airplanes at that time were about, by 1940, they were about 10 years behind. You had a number of airplane companies that were out there that were trying to survive. You had Lockheed, and you had Bell, and you had Curtiss, and you had Douglas, and you had Boeing, and you had North American that just been formed. And though these companies were doing R&D, the P-47 was in the works, the Lockheed P-38 was in the works, the P-36 was in the works. Nobody really had an airplane that was really technologically advanced for the time. And of course, then in 1940, Clarence E went over to try to help the Chinese fight the Japanese off. America was pretty much split. You know, I would be hesitant to ask how many Democrats and how many Republicans there are. I hope there's a lot of Republicans in the crowd with what's going on with me right now. But at any rate, America in 1940 was pretty much split evenly on whether we should forget about Japan. That's happening over in the Far East, and China's almost none of our business. And for sure, we don't want to get involved in a deal in Europe. And so there was even some real big names, some people that are close to me that were pretty much and wanted to stay out of it at that time. So there was no funding except for the fact that Clarence E was given some airplanes. The Chinese were given some airplanes, and Clarence E, who retired from the Army Air Corps, formed the AVG, took the Curtiss P-40s over there, figured out they couldn't turn with they couldn't go top speed with a zero. They couldn't climb with a zero. They couldn't turn with a zero, but they could sure fly through their formations and tear the hell out of them. So he figured out how to dive through, and in spite of the fact the airplane was not competitive, he was able to do his business with it. Lockheed was having a lot of trouble with their P-38, didn't have enough money from the government to develop it, so it was behind. 1940, the Battle of Britain started, and it looked like that we might lose Britain. And so the British, the British Air Purchasing Commission came over, wanted to talk about having some airplanes built. They talked to Curtiss, they talked to Bell, they wanted to get going. They talked to North American. They wanted North American to build the P-40, and I see where my name's here. Gus Kingelberger was the head of North American, and his chief designer was a fellow by the name of Edgar Smoot. Edward Horkey was the aerodynamist, and they had been working as a skunk works on some ideas that they thought were better than the Spitfire. It would be better than what they had heard about, what they believed the Japanese and the Germans were doing. It was all on a napkin. It was all just in their heads. And so when the Air Purchasing Commission came over and said, we want you to tool up the P-40, they held their nose. They said, well, this thing is not going to be competitive. It's got a low altitude Allison engine in it that's going to have its own problem because it won't get up to the altitude that the fight's at. And so they negotiated, North America negotiated, and they finally got them to cave in that it was going to take 120 days to get all the drawings made and to get the tooling transferred and get ready to build this P-40 under license. They said, if you can present to us an airplane that's got your ideas in it in 120 days, which is the tooling time and the approval time, he says, we'll order a few airplanes. So in 120 days, they got the airplane finished. It had a laminar flow wing, which if you ever looked at a bass fish that's swimming away from you and you're wishing you could catch it, the plan view of a bass fish is pretty much the same symmetry and the same profile as this wing. The Germans actually captured some of the airplanes early in the war. When they are in the middle of the war, they overran some bases and got hold of an airplane. They never figured out what the magic of the wing was. They thought it was about the flush rivets and the engine. They didn't realize how special the wing was. They had flush rivets. The guys that organized the scoop for the airplane, that glycol cooling system scoop, that generates enough thrust to offset the drag that the cross-sectional area of the scoop gave you. So they had a number of ideas. The NASA NACA was doing some research as a government agency, and they were the ones that actually had the laminar flow wing. It wasn't North American. But they put all those ideas together on a napkin, got approved. There was probably some alcohol involved. Got their 120 days, and they did the airplane. One of the things that North American did, they were making at that time the AT-6 that there's a lot of on the field, and they were in the startup for the B-25 bomber, but they were not doing any fighter airplanes. The Allison engine was single stage. It was single stage supercharged engine, 1,700 cubic inches that made 1,120 horsepower at sea level, which was competitive, except that it only made half that at 20,000 feet, and you couldn't go over 30,000 feet. You couldn't drag it up higher than that with that engine on it. So that was the engine that was available. They initially built it with the P-51A and the A-36. Started delivering those in 1941 to the English in small numbers. The U.S. Air Corps establishment, Army Air Corps Purchasing Agency, they got a hold of a couple of them and poo-pooed it because it wasn't all that much faster than a P-40, and of course they believed the Lockheed was going to be faster than that, and the P-47 had a 2800 engine on it, so it was going to be really fast, even though as it turned out later, it burned too much gas. Looking at some key dates, in April 1942, they fitted the airplane with drop tanks. The tanks on the B model here are 108 gallons. That airplane will stay in, that particular airplane, Bud's B model, will stay in the air for over 7 hours with those drop tanks and with the internal fuel. In the same year, 1942, they did the dive brake installation to the P-51. That was the A-36. So the P-51A and the A-36 were ground attack, ground support airplanes. They were not air superiority airplanes. They could not go over Western Europe. They couldn't follow the bombers. Initially, all the people thought, the planners thought that the bombers, particularly B-17 and B-24, didn't need to have fighter protection. They thought that with the 10 50 caliber guns they had, with the 5 mounts they had on board, that they could fight everybody off. But they found out that wasn't true. They only had losses that were unsustainable and unacceptable. In November 30th, 1942, the Packard-built Merlin was first put on the Mustang. And the B's, the C's, the D's, the K's, and the H's all had Packard Merlin engines on. The Merlin engine was 2-speed, 2-stage supercharged, would make 1,400 horsepower to 30,000 feet. And it had a service ceiling of 42. So it would do anything that the Mustang, anything that the Spitfire would do, which was the best airplane the English had, except that it would do it for 7 hours, 7 or 8 hours, where the Spitfire could only do it for an hour or so. The P-51, the Merlin engine brought 10,000 additional feet of service ceiling and 50 mile an hour in speed. You know, in numbers, there were about 2,000, there was 1,000, roughly 1,000 P-51As and A-36s. Those were low altitude airplanes. There were 2,000 P-51Bs and Cs, which were built alternately in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas, and there were about 12,000 of the Ds. It's been my great pleasure to help restore these airplanes, to help make it the parts for them, to keep them be safe, to keep them out there, and to really have a chance to engage in this. Ed and Connie Bolin soloed me in their J3 Cub. They soloed me in their AT6. They stand at their, Connie is very active in the Warbird movement here. Ed is at her side, and they're the sponsors for all that we're doing here in terms of identifying the people and being able to restore the airplanes. Let's give Ed and Connie a big hand. I could go on and on, but one of the things I'm going to say before I turn it over to Bud, which I know everybody's anxious to hear him, Bud in fact had 4 P-51s. He had 3 B models, which were the ones like this airplane that was built in Inglewood, California. With the B, they were trying to win air superiority over the Germans. The airplane had to fly every day. So the maintenance crew worked all night. The airplane flew every day. Bud flew it every second or third day. So on days when he didn't go, or he stood down for planning reasons and other reasons, somebody else flew his airplane. He lost 2 of the B models and lost 2 good friends, you know, in the airplanes that didn't survive. The B model that this airplane replicates survived his first tour, and was it 50 missions, Bud? 300 hours in his first tour, and it became the Berlin Express, and it was ultimately scrapped. It was never shot down in the war. He had 9 victories with it. When he went and finished his first 300 hours, went home, had an R&R, and rather than get in the training, he wanted to come back and get back in the fight. So when he came back, he got a D model, which is Jim Hagedorn's airplane. And he shot down 7 additional airplanes of that, making a total of 16. He was a triple ace. He's one of the world's greatest aviators, without question. He's one of America's bravest heroes. He's one of the EAA's long-standing, most loyal supporters, and he's my best friend. Bud Anderson, I'm humbled to be at your side.